God said one word. And the world stood still. No one knew that a single moment could split existence into a before and after. No one imagined that the pulse of life, the ticking of clocks, the hum of cities, the breathing of creation, could be halted by something as small and as mighty as a word. But that is exactly how it began. One instant, the world roared with motion, the next, everything surrendered to a silence so perfect that even thoughts felt loud. God spoke, not in thunder, not in flame, not in wind or whisper, just one word, a word so pure and heavy with purpose that reality itself bowed, and the world stood still. Birds froze mid-flight, suspended in sky like strokes of paint. Ocean waves curled, waiting to break but never falling. Leaves hung in the air like floating emeralds. Cities paused mid-breath, cars locked in place, people caught mid-step, laughter sealed in the air before sound could finish forming. Nothing broke, nothing collapsed, everything simply waited, as if creation itself turned toward the voice that had shaped it. Time didn't stop because of danger, it didn't freeze out of punishment, it halted because God wanted humanity to hear something they could never notice while rushing, and incredibly, even though bodies were frozen, souls were not. Inside each person, hidden beneath routines and fears and the endless noise of life, consciousness awakened, free to move within the stillness. People found themselves standing in a world paused like a photograph, yet their inner selves were alive, watching, feeling, remembering, hoping, and then every soul felt the word resonate again, gently this time, like a heartbeat echoing across heaven, enough. It wasn't a word of anger, it was a word of mercy, enough running from yourself, enough numbing your dreams, enough shrinking your purpose, enough pretending you are powerless, enough believing the world can silence the greatness placed inside you, enough waiting for the right time while the days slipped through your fingers. The world stood still because people had forgotten how to stand still within themselves. They had forgotten how to breathe with intention. They had forgotten the weight of meaning, the sensation of being alive without distraction, and so God paused everything, not to stop life, but to help people finally see it. In that vast stillness, every soul was brought face to face with itself. Some saw the dreams they abandoned along the road. Others saw the person they were before fear disguised itself as logic. Many looked at the scars they had been hiding under bravery, realizing they were stronger than every wound. Some felt the quiet ache of choices they had postponed too long. Others felt a fire they had not sensed in years. People realized something profound. Nothing in the world had stopped them from becoming who they wished to be, nothing but their own hesitation. That single word, enough, struck each person differently, reshaping their thoughts with the precision of light reshaping darkness. It spoke to the mother who always put herself last, reminding her that she deserved her own care too. It spoke to the young man drowning in expectations, whispering that he had permission to define his own path. It spoke to the dreamer who buried their talent, telling them the world needed the very gift they were afraid to offer. It spoke to the quiet hearts who loved deeply but never expressed it, urging them that time is fragile and love was never meant to stay unspoken. It spoke to the weary soul losing hope, letting them feel that even in stillness, they were not forgotten. Then something remarkable happened. In the frozen world, light began to move. It didn't break time's stillness, it glided through it. A soft golden radiance stretched across cities, weaving between paused raindrops and silent clouds. It wasn't sunlight or firelight, it was understanding. People felt it touch their souls like a gentle hand lifting their chin. The light showed each person a version of themselves they had always been capable of becoming, a stronger self, a braver self, a self finally aligned with the purpose they once sensed but didn't know how to reach. The stillness became a mirror, revealing the truth. Every person had been waiting for the world to change, without realizing that the world needed them to change first. And so thoughts began to shift. The doubter felt courage flicker for the first time in years. The impatient felt peace. The discouraged felt a spark. The lost felt direction. The broken felt restoration beginning in places they thought were unreachable. God's one word was not about stopping the world. It was about restarting the human heart. Across the silent cities, a new determination began forming inside souls, a quiet vow that when the world moved again, they would move differently. Some promised to chase the dream they kept postponing. Some swore to heal relationships instead of letting pride lead them. Some vowed to stop treating survival like the ceiling when it was only the floor. Some decided they would no longer hand their power to doubt, fear, or regret. Some chose to forgive themselves for things they could not change. Some finally accepted that their value was not measured by perfection, but by persistence. Every soul made a silent agreement with itself. When time begins again, I will not live the same way I did before it stopped. And then something even more extraordinary occurred. People began to notice that although the world was frozen, their hearts were beating stronger than ever. They felt the rhythm of life more sharply than when everything was moving. The stillness wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, clarity, and a kind of hope that did not depend on circumstances. A realization spread across humanity. Purpose doesn't come from speed, vision doesn't come from noise, strength doesn't come from comfort, awakening doesn't come from everything going right. It comes from finally listening to what has always been inside. The world had been moving too fast for too long. In chasing what was next, people had forgotten to appreciate what was now. So God paused the world, not as punishment, but as a chance, a reset, a gift, a reminder that life was not meant to be lived half awake. And somewhere in that cosmic stillness, each soul heard a second whisper, soft, warm, undeniable, begin. A single word to stop the world, a single word to start the soul. The stillness didn't end immediately. The transition wasn't abrupt. It was as if time exhaled, stretching gently before returning to motion. Raindrops began falling again, birds resumed their flight, and cities breathed long and deep, like waking from the most meaningful sleep they had ever known. When people opened their eyes back into motion, nothing looked different, yet everything felt different. The world was the same, but they were not. They moved with more intention. They spoke with more purpose. They treated each moment less like a habit and more like a privilege. The small things mattered again. The big things felt possible again. The impossible things felt worth trying again. Everyone carried a quiet fire now, a steady certainty that their life meant something, something real, something irreplaceable, because when God said one word and the world stood still, humanity remembered something ancient and powerful. They were created with purpose, designed with intention, capable of rising, rebuilding, and becoming. Capable of more than they ever believed. And after that day, whenever fear tried to whisper that life was too hard or dreams were too distant, people remembered the world pausing in that single, divine echo within their souls. Time moved again, but not at the pace it once did. It felt slower, gentler, as if even time had learned something from the great stillness. People took their first steps like travelers returning from a long journey, not rushed, not careless, but deeply aware. Every blink felt like a beginning. Every breath felt like a promise. Some people cried without knowing why, wiping tears they didn't feel ashamed of anymore. Others smiled, a real smile, the kind they hadn't worn in years, the kind that stretched from the heart outward. Some stood completely still, allowing the world to move around them as they observed the simple miracle of motion returning. And others simply exhaled, releasing years of tension they didn't know had been living inside their bodies. Life resumed, but no one resumed living the way they used to. In the days that followed, stories spread, not through headlines or broadcasts, but through whispers, glances, and quiet confessions. People shared what they had felt in the stillness, not to prove anything, but because the experience had left an imprint too powerful to keep hidden. A man who had been carrying resentment for half his life walked across town to knock on a door he had avoided for years. When it opened, he didn't rehearse the apology he once feared giving. He simply looked into familiar eyes and allowed truth to speak without force. The pain didn't vanish instantly, but something softened, an opening that could grow. A young woman who always silenced her own voice finally stood in front of a blank canvas, holding a brush that had collected more dust than memory. When she touched paint to the canvas, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. She didn't paint to impress anyone. She painted because the stillness had reminded her that a soul becomes restless when its gift remains unused. An elderly man who thought life had passed him by felt a new hum in his spirit. He had spent decades believing his purpose had expired alongside his youth. Yet in the stillness, he had seen the truth: purpose does not age. It only waits. And so he began writing the stories he had kept in his heart for 40 years. The words came slowly, but they came honestly, and for the first time, he felt young again. A boy who never believed he mattered saw, in the frozen world, the outline of the man he could grow into, a man with strength, compassion, and courage. He didn't understand everything he felt, but he understood enough. He would no longer measure himself by what others saw in him, but by what he now recognized in himself. And everywhere, all across the world, people started to make changes, small ones, quiet ones, but powerful ones. Changes that did not make a sound, yet changed the sound of everything. The stillness changed priorities in ways no speech or rule or crisis ever could. People realized that life wasn't meant to be a race filled with noise, but a journey shaped by meaning. They began valuing time, not as something to survive, but as something to shape. Parents who once hurried through moments began lingering a bit longer, listening to their children's stories with interest instead of impatience. Friends checked on each other more genuinely, no longer treating connection as a formality. Strangers smiled more easily, sensing the shared vulnerability of having lived through a moment too sacred for explanation. Even nature seemed to glow differently. Sunsets felt warmer, as if the sky had watched humanity awaken and painted its approval across the horizon. Morning light felt new, as though it carried a message in every golden ray: you survived. Now live, and yet, amid all the newfound clarity, there was something else, something subtle but profound. People felt an inner tug toward the dreams they once believed were reserved for others. They felt a pull to grow, to rise, to truly live out the potential that had always been flickering inside them. The realization spread quietly from heart to heart. The word God had spoken to stop the world had also been spoken to ignite the world within each person. People understood something they had not known before. They couldn't keep waiting for permission to become themselves. They couldn't keep hoping life would slow down long enough for them to begin. The world had already given them that moment, the greatest pause in history. Now it was their turn to move with intention. Even those who had struggled the most, those who felt forgotten, those who felt lost, those who carried heavy pasts, felt something shifting. They realized that growth was not about erasing scars, but about walking forward with them, allowing each one to whisper, "You made it." And so, slowly and quietly, the world began transforming, not through miracles in the sky, but through miracles in the heart. People who had been afraid of failure decided they would rather fail while trying than succeed at staying small. People who had allowed the world to define them began defining themselves. People who once clung to excuses discovered courage disguised as longing. Everywhere, people began to rise, not loudly, not perfectly, but purposefully. Sometimes the changes were almost invisible. Someone choosing to wake up earlier, someone deciding to speak a word of kindness, someone refusing to let fear dictate their choices again. Other times, the changes were bold, someone quitting a job that had drained them for years. Someone starting a new journey in a completely unfamiliar direction, someone confessing a truth they had buried too deep for too long. But all the changes shared one thing in common: they began with the moment the world stood still. People discovered that clarity does not always shout, it often arrives in silence. Strength does not always roar, it often whispers. And purpose does not always strike like lightning, it often grows like dawn, slow but certain. The great stillness had not given humanity all the answers, it had given them something far more powerful, a beginning, and beginnings, as the world would soon discover, hold more power than endings ever will, as the days turned into weeks. People wondered whether the moment the world froze had been a miracle, a warning, or something in between. But the truth didn't lie in definitions. It lived in the transformation happening quietly in the human heart. There was a shift across the world, not dramatic enough to capture on a camera, but undeniable in the way people began to carry themselves. There was more softness in the way they spoke to others. More patience in the way they dealt with challenges. More courage in the decisions that once frightened them. The stillness had reminded everyone that life was not a test of endurance, but a canvas longing for intention. People began to notice beauty in places they once overlooked. They noticed how morning air felt like forgiveness, how dusk felt like closure, how laughter felt like medicine. They noticed how dreams felt less like fantasies and more like instructions written into their soul. Dreams no longer felt distant, they felt reachable. The stillness had shown humanity that movement had meaning only when driven by purpose. So people stopped rushing for the sake of rushing. They stopped pretending they didn't care about things that mattered deeply. They stopped hiding from the world as if the world wasn't waiting for what they carried inside. Everyone carried a fire now, some small, some blazing, but all real. And then, something extraordinary happened. The world began healing from the inside out. Not because suffering vanished, but because people began meeting suffering with strength they didn't know they possessed. Not because life became easy, but because people finally learned how to navigate it with clarity instead of fear. In every city, every village, every home, someone woke up each morning with a deeper sense of purpose. They didn't need the world to freeze again to remind them. They didn't need a sign in the sky. They had already been given the greatest sign of all, a moment of absolute silence in which their soul finally spoke louder than everything around them. People understood now that the word God had spoken, enough, was not an end. It was a threshold. It meant enough shrinking, enough doubting, enough delaying, enough carrying wounds like chains, enough resisting the greatness quietly growing inside. The stillness was a sacred pause, a divine reset, so people could finally hear themselves, hear their calling, hear the truth they had drowned beneath responsibilities and worries and noise. And the second word, begin, became the whisper guiding them forward. It echoed every time someone pushed through fear. It resounded every time someone started something they once thought impossible. It breathed strength into every journey, reminding people that beginnings shape destiny. People finally understood that God had not paused the world to stop life. He paused it so they could start living. And so humanity moved forward, not perfectly, but intentionally. Life still had storms, but people walked with a steadier step. Life still had sorrow, but hearts held more hope than before. Life still had uncertain paths, but people chose to walk them anyway, because the moment the world stood still, they realized something they had forgotten. They were not accidents. They were not powerless. They were not lost beyond repair. They were not defined by past mistakes. They were not created to merely survive. They were created to rise. Even years later, the world would recall that moment with reverence. Not because everything froze, but because everything awakened. Children who were too young to understand grew up hearing stories of the day the world paused so souls could remember themselves. And adults who lived through it carried the moment like a quiet flame, lighting their path whenever darkness tried to return. Whenever fear whispered, they remembered the stillness. Whenever doubt tried to silence them, they remembered the light that moved even when time could not. Whenever they questioned their worth, they remembered the voice that spoke directly to their soul. People learned that they did not need the world to stop again. The power had been inside them all along. A single word had changed the world. A single word had restarted the human spirit. A single moment had reminded every living soul that purpose was never distant, just hidden beneath hurry. And from that day forward, whenever someone hesitated to chase the life calling out to them, they remembered the divine whisper that echoed across creation, the whisper that pulled them from the shadows of doubt into the light of possibility. Begin. And so they did, and the world, one courageous soul at a time, transformed, not because time stood still again, but because humanity finally refused to. If you want